Hi, so I am in the Select and Mask workspace, and I have used the magic wand to click around my image. So I'm masking off this area. That's going to be my selection is this area. I'm masking off here. So because I wanted to do something with my background, I can also invert that if I want it to be on here, depending on what I want to do. But as you can see, the magic wand only goes so far and does, just not a completely amazing job. Now, these are source photos. You don't necessarily need them to be perfect selection. So it's up to you how good you want your selection to be for your source photo. But for me, texture is really important. So I always like my source photos to be pretty strong. Now, I am going to click on, we've already gone over the lasso tool, but I'm going to click on the lasso tool and I'm going to press Alt, or if you're on a Mac, press Option to just kind of get around this area, because I don't want that. Well, that was a little too much over into the background, but I don't want it to be part of my selection. So I'm going to kind of go over there. And this is a really nice, so this is going to add to it, which is not what I wanted. So I've got to hold down the Alt, or I can just go up to the controls on the options bar. There we go. I can also use a tool called Refine Edge. Let's see a good spot for that. So for example, right here, where I might want to refine some of this edge quickly, I can just kind of brush over that. And it takes a while. This is using a lot of processing power. So it didn't do much here, actually. Sometimes it is better than other times. So let's go over here. This area might be a nice one for it to play with here. So we can kind of play with that. And you've got to play with your sliders as well. Okay, so that did a little bit. But in this case, I think the best tool for the job is the lasso with the subtract mode on the lasso, because it's making it very easy for me to deselect. Okay, that's too much. It's making very easy for me to deselect certain areas. Okay, so you can keep going as far as you want and then make your selection. You can use the brush masking tool. So I just really wanted to get you comfortable with those. And then I can always go to just layer mask or new layer with layer mask. But I'm just going to go over to layer mask because I've copied my layer. I've gone Control J to copy my layer. I've unlocked that layer. So now if I want to play with the background and create, let's say I want to create some sort of gradient fill, I can. Okay, so I've created a layer adjustment gradient fill here, and I've chosen one of the gradients that uses transparency, and I've also played with the colors. It's very easy. Actually, this isn't the one I wanted. I want that one. Playing with the colors and also just playing with where the values are in this gradient, kind of playing around with that. So having a little more transparency, that's kind of my goal here. I want a little more transparency, and I want these colors a little more subtle. So I'm going and playing with less saturated and less dark values. So I'm doing some higher key and not so many lower key values. And getting that nice and subtle. This is even too intense, and this is too intense. So really playing around with that. So it's this nice, very subtle gradient. So then I'm going to click OK. I can play with where it's angled. I can make it more something along these lines. So then I've got that. Now I can just play with blend modes, and I can create some really interesting effects to work from very quickly. Or I can click on this, Control Alt or Option, and move it over here. Yes. So then I've got it in the background. So I can do that. I can play, there's a lot of things I can play with, but if I just wanted this gradient to be in the background, I've got that option. And I can turn this by clicking Shift on top of it and go back and play with all of these wonderful blending modes that make quick effects as well. So another thing I can do, I can turn that back on, or I can turn it off. I can also just press Alt on it, and to see at my actual, I can actually see my mask. The other thing I can do, I can just turn these guys off and go back to my original, is I can actually go straight over to filters. I can play with blurs. Whoops. I can explore with some of these, like the Gaussian blur. And let's say I want to do a painting of something that's just a little bit blurred. So it's this very subtle where you can't quite articulate, you know, what's happening there. So that's, you know, that's a fun method as well. Or I could create a layer mask, and I could create a, let's use just the regular lasso tool. I'm just going to create a really quick selection. And then I'm going to fill that. Just make sure you have a copy of your layer. So I've made my really quick lasso mask, and I have made sure that it's inverted so that the background is what is selected. Now I have just gone to filter Gaussian blur, and I can play around with blurring certain parts, almost acting as kind of a tilt shift. The other thing you can do is you can use, and that's really fun, that's an interesting effect. So the cool thing is I can just turn that off, and I haven't destroyed my original image, just in case I want to explore with it. But the cool thing is let's say, let's go back here. So I have not applied the Gaussian blur to anything. If we convert this into a smart object, then when we go to do layer adjustments, you can easily turn them on and off, just like you can do with the adjustment layers. So playing with that, playing with this, then you have a smart filter that you can turn on and off. And this layer, then you can go back. You can click on that individual layer, as I did over here, so you can look at that and alter that. So this is a really fun feature too. So I'm going to turn that off and try a different filter. I'm going to go to, we can also play with all types of blurs. You can play with field blur, spin blur. You can play with noise, pixelate, pointillate. So you can do this kind of, let's see. And again, this is not being affected. So you can create these really interesting effects very fast. Okay, so let's see, wave, render. There's also lens flares, sharpen, stylize. So stylize, you could try wind and see what happens when you play with that. Let's see, let's go ahead. So you've got these funny little kind of edges, these elements, and you can kind of, the cool thing is you can keep going and you can just do Alt Control F over and over again and keep applying that filter. So Alt Control F. Until it just becomes, you can create a really interesting effect. And again, you've got this selection. You can adjust the selection so that those edges are more feathered, but you're starting to create some really interesting things here. And this is all adjustable with the smart objects and the smart filters. So you can play with that, and then you can play with more filters on top of filters. You can also create an oil painting filter. Let's see how stylized. You can show different things. So this is probably going to create a very strange effect because because I had the wind feature on. So there's a lot you can do here. I mean, I could throw on my gradient and see what happens there as well. That's pretty fun. So you can really create a lot of different effects. So this is just kind of dipping into those, but also showing the importance of, really, let's just turn all of these off. Using Photoshop for the next bit of editing after you do your 3D. Now, here is just the plain image. I can then also go into Camera Raw and play with that. And, I can play with I can change the color scheme just instantly. So instead of going through the whole render process, I can change the tint, and I could do a whole series just based on this image, but just adjusting it, playing with contrast. Maybe I want less contrast, more contrast. Maybe I want to play with the highlights. Again, I can play with shadow highlight as well. Playing with vibrance, saturation. Maybe I want it really saturated. So I can do that. I can also really go into these different features here, and I can play with sharpening if I want everything to be a little more crisp. I can zoom in here so I can see what I'm doing more. So if I want everything to be a little more crisp and a little less blurry, play with sharpening. That's really great when you're somebody like me who loves texture. Play with the radius of the sharpening. And that's all right in this workspace here. You can get really into detail with what colors you want to push or remove. And again, if you have this as a smart object, you can turn this on and off. So split toning, so you can play with the shadows, the highlights, and what the colors are in those. There's a lot to kind of explore with. You can play with some effects. Let's see what happens when we play with grain. So it creates a little bit of a grainy effect. You can make it more of a grain or less of a grain. Vignetting. So there's a lot of stuff you can play with, and then you've got your presets. You can also use a curve option. So the tone curves. So, and then there's your just standard features here. You can play with it like this. You can move this around. Another option too is you can actually use this thing called the adjustment brush. This is really cool. And you can go to a specific area you want to adjust and create a pin. So I can create some pins for, whoops. Let's see, this is the adjustment brush. Okay, so you can create some pins, and then you can play with things in that specific area so you're not affecting the other areas. So playing with the highlights there, maybe I want more highlights there, maybe blacks or what, and just really playing, or maybe I want this color affected. I want it a little greener. So that's really fun. And then when you're not on that pin, you're not going to be, that's not going to get adjusted. But I can make those subtle, quick detail changes to my renders that are really helpful. And if you're working on faces, you can remove red eyes. You can create different filters. So if I wanted to create some sort of, I just wanted to show part of this, and I can expand it. I just want to make it so that you just see this little part. So there's some really cool artistic effects you can have there. So that's kind of fun. And again, you can play with the tints. Okay. So, and it holds on to these pins you've created, and you can move them around. So this is a really, you can make a tilt shift. So just like in Instagram. So this is a really fun feature, the camera raw. So we really just dipped our toes into it last week, but this really goes more in depth, and it shows us how to apply these skills that we're learning in our future practices with the 3D software.